Welcome to GS Podcast number 94, the first one of 2017 in fact, so no, I'm not dead. I actually have a day job. It's even worse when you think about it. So it's kept me incredibly busy at the start of the year, as these things usually do. If you'd like to have me making content full time, this includes podcast, videos on YouTube, blog post, so I can dedicate all my time to it, or even reduce my hours at work, you can support me on Patreon, which is patreon.com/gspellchecker. That just allows you to give as much as you like per month, whenever you like. Essentially, you can set limits. You can essentially say, I like what this guy does. You can get $1 a month, or £1 a month, or a shekel, I'm not sure, euros, I'm not sure what all the world currencies are, but you get the idea. And if a very small percentage, probably about 1% of the people who listen to the podcast and access my blog contribute in this way, I could probably dedicate myself full time to it. So, think on. I've got a great episode for you. I'm very pleased to welcome Matt Dillahunty back to the GS podcast. I'm sure many of you are familiar with Matt and his work. He's a sort of counter-religious apologist. He takes apart religious arguments like I've never seen. He's one of the hosts of the Atheist Experience. So definitely punch that into YouTube if you haven't heard of it. And very, very reasonable guy. Looks at things in a very balanced way. It's kind of serves as a good reminder as well that sometimes you can be a little bit too sure how you lean on a particular point, and when you haven't really considered the opposite side. So I was very grateful to have this conversation with him. You can find Matt on Twitter at Matt_Dillahunty. Send him some kind words. He also has a Patreon page himself, so if you like his stuff, make sure you consider supporting him. But we touch on some big topics that have been enraging the press and the internet in general these last few weeks or so, from whether it's ethical to punch a Nazi, to whether violent protests are a good idea. So we cover that in some good detail. I think it's probably one of the longest podcasts I've done, so it'll fly by, don't worry, but buckle in. You can keep up to date on this show at gspellchecker.com. Enjoy. It's a great pleasure to welcome Matt Dillahunty back to the GS podcast. Hello.
Hi, how you been?
I'm fantastic. How are you?
I'm doing all right. Things are a little hectic. I mean, it's been, I don't know how long it's been. The first time we met and the last time I saw you was when I was in Manchester for QED 2 years ago.
Yeah, and they ran you out of town, and you've not been allowed to travel back since, as far as I've heard anyway.
Is that the official position of the UK government?
Yeah.
It's strange because I got several, just in the past couple of weeks, I've received several emails from people saying, hey, do you have any events, coming up in anywhere in the UK, or, London, Manchester, whatever. And the answer, unfortunately, is no, not currently. I don't have any plans there, but there's a bunch of other stuff going on, including magic shows in Vancouver and lectures and debates at different places. I desperately want to get back to the UK. I want to get back to Australia. I want to get back to everywhere. I would love to just travel around and, because how awesome is it to just have people want to listen to you talk, even if you don't make any sense and you're not sure what you're going to say?
I have no idea, I'll be honest. But I mean, yeah, that was great. I think you asked when it was. I checked before we dialed in. It was April 2015, and I interviewed you and Erin Ra in my swanky Manchester hotel room because you was at QED Con, and you did a fantastic talk, by the way. And I was just trying to think, actually, how much has changed in terms of the political landscape since that date. We've had Brexit. Britain's voted to leave the EU, which nobody expected. You've got a new man in the White House, which I'm sure is going to feed into a lot of what we'll speak about today. Europe looks like it's leaning more and more to the right. Before we jump into some of the bigger things we want to dive in on, maybe you could just give me your feeling about Trump USA. Where do you stand on this uncertain future, to say the least?
Yeah, I've been paying, I thought when the election was over, I would stop paying so much attention to the news. And it turns out that after a slight break, basically from the inauguration on, I have paid attention to much more news than I ever expected. And it's interesting because I absolutely despise Trump. As far as I'm concerned, he is not only the least qualified person to ever run for and win the presidency, but clearly, in my view, wholly unqualified. And it's one of those things where, every now and then somebody jokingly will, or maybe not jokingly, but to me it's a joke, say, hey, Matt Dillahunty for president. And I'm like, I'm not qualified. I know how not qualified I am. And to wake up every day in a world where someone who is orders of magnitude less qualified than I would be to be in that office is frustrating and potentially terrifying. I try not to, one of my biggest, I guess, enemies, I care about the truth, but hyperbole is incredibly frustrating.
Hyperbole will be the death of us all.
Yes, I actually gave a talk with that title.
Oh, I stole it from you then.
I think it was Hyperbole Will Destroy the World or something like that.
Brilliant.
And so, is Trump, well, I'll do this on the Trump thing because I think I can get through it real quickly. And that is, I went on my Christmas trip to visit family and friends, and it was a couple weeks long. It's a big road trip that Beth and I take every year. And I was absolutely terrified of having to have political conversations with people who, I'm related to and love and care about, and I don't want to, destroy every relationship just because we disagree on this. On the other hand, I've also, flat out blocked people here and there when they're just making awful arguments in support of Trump. It's not every Trump supporter that I blocked, but some of them. So I avoided most of the conversations, but there was one interesting one where somebody talked about how and why they either voted for Trump or almost voted for Trump. And this person they're moderate, they're liberal leaning in some areas, they are conservative leaning in other areas. And I get that. I don't happen to share it. The people who say or the people who identify as socially liberal and fiscally conservative, I think they don't understand that is actually in conflict, that you cannot properly support liberal positions on social issues without the funding that you're not willing to give up. It's like saying, yeah, I really wish you had a better life, but I'm not willing to actually do anything about it. It's kind of been my take on it. But the person I was talking to said that he either voted for Trump or almost voted for Trump, in part because liberals were calling Trump supporters racists. And the racist label has a number of different usages. If two people are talking and they are not both aware of how a particular word is being used, you're screwed. And so, I've seen big arguments about where people are saying, oh, racism is prejudice plus power. And then somebody else will say, no, that's not what it is. As if there is a single definition. It should be simple enough to say, when I use the word racism, I mean prejudice plus power. When I use the word racism, I just mean simple racism. But they weren't aware of the difference between like implicit racism and explicit racism. And they weren't aware of the difference between, individual bigotry and systemic racism, where we might have a law that might inadvertently, whether it was intentional or not, negatively affect a particular minority. And so he's basically sitting there, and the liberals are saying, oh, the Trump supporters are racist. And he's like, hang on, because in his mind, yeah, racism is we're going to burn a cross in your front yard and talk, and do what we can to get rid of, the black folks or the Mexican folks or whatever, in an overt way. That was the only version of racism that even registered in his head. And so when liberals would call the Trump supporters racist, he would hear something that they weren't necessarily saying, Basically, they were, I suppose, saying, hey, you're willing to support somebody who's implementing policies that have a negative effect on different minorities. And so they were using a broad version of the term, and he was only able to hear a narrow version because that's all he knew about. And he's like, well, that's bull, you know. And by the way, I don't know what the limits of language are on your show.
Everything apart from cuck, I think, is okay.
Everything apart from cuck, okay.
Well, maybe I could just ask you about this whole racism viewed through the lens of the power dynamic, because I agree that people have different understandings and they're all valid in their own ways, but do you not think this idea of racism is only racism if it's got power attached has become the pervasive narrative within, you know, liberal institutions and mainstream dialogue? Certainly in the UK, it's taken hold. We've had a number of politicians use it in that manner. I mean, I just wanted to get your take on that.
Yeah, I think it's clearly becoming, you know, much better understood and more frequently used. But we have sort of a bias. So first of all, you live in a country that I view as far more in tune and modern than a good chunk of my country.
Okay.
I run across people on a regular basis who not only are completely unfamiliar with that particular usage, but are just dumbfounded that any such, I mean, they don't even have the requisite foundation to even talk about this. Like, we get into arguments about privilege all the time. And my position is really simple. Privilege is real. I am the beneficiary of mountains of privilege, but that doesn't mean that privilege is also always the most significant factor in an issue. It can be. You have to actually make the case for it. And merely saying to someone, well, that's your privilege talking, or using privilege as something to dismiss an argument doesn't mean you've defended your position in any way. It's like, you know, I fully acknowledge as I rattle off all the different ways in which I'm privileged, you know, white, middle class, you know, cisgendered, blah, 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 able-bodied, all of these things. I recognize that all of these things are true. And one important thing is that some of the people who are essentially using the term privilege, or some might argue overusing it, but I would say that are using it in an attempt to make people aware of this, they're also not saying that privilege is your fault. I mean, this is kind of a happenstance. You find yourself in this world that, for reasons that aren't your fault, favor certain traits about you. And I recognize that. But also, if I'm having a conversation with somebody and I've made a reasoned argument and their response is, well, that's just your privilege talking. Well, even if they're right, they haven't made their case, which is why it's so frustrating. Because if you want to explain to somebody that, no, you are wrong in your view because you are looking at this through the eyes of privilege, you have to do more than just assert that that's the case. Because then it just becomes a hand-waving exercise. It's not informing or educating people about anything.
Aren't you just mansplaining right now, though?
I am mansplaining, which, you know, I'm entitled to do because of my privilege. And I don't mean to. So one of the things is that I'm not dismissing the idea. If anything, I have repeatedly and wholeheartedly acknowledged I am the beneficiary of just mountains of privilege. And what I would prefer, you know, is that we begin to eliminate privilege by elevating everybody rather than trying to claw the beneficiaries of privilege down. Although you may have to sacrifice some aspects of that, you know. I mean, there is a balance there, but I don't want to mock or dismiss the notion because I recognize that it's real. I just don't. It's not an argument in and of itself. You have to do just a bit more. Yeah,
I agree. I mean, I recognize that I do mock them occasionally, but there's a reason for this. I think. I mean, these are virtuous ideas of privilege and oppression and race and things like that. And I think what happens is a lot of people take these things and run with them as an identity and then muddy the waters for everyone else. Because, you know, 9 times out of 10 now when I see the word privilege, it's because I'm being told to shut up. Same with, you know, the power dynamic in racism, and I just think we could do with clawing back a bit of the landscape from these people who use it purely to stifle conversation.
Yeah, so part of this came up. I saw really interesting discussions surrounding the punching of Nazis. And because I think his name's Richard Spencer, who was giving this interview on a street, and somebody came up and sucker punched him.
Yes.
I saw conversations, and people are going to make bad arguments. It's unavoidable,
especially on Twitter. It's a prerequisite.
Yeah, Twitter. I mean, Facebook. It was all over the place. So my position is really simple, and that is, I'm not going to applaud or encourage sucker punching, violence directed toward someone who is expressing a view that you find deplorable.
Yeah,
I just can't. But I also recognize why people laughed, why people got a visceral sense of justice. I mean, it's vigilantes feel that they're, dispensing justice. The question is, are they? And what happened was, before I could even comment on this to anybody, I'd had a long conversation with a comedian friend of mine who was in town, and we disagree, but he made, some kind of compelling points. And then there were other people who were like, don't you tell me how to feel. Well, not only was I never telling anyone how they should feel about that, I wasn't even necessarily trying to tell them what they should do. I was talking about what I personally could or couldn't support and why. And rather than address that, and sometimes before it had even been said, some individuals were just like, well, if you don't agree with me that sucker punching a Nazi on a street corner is a good thing, then you're just supporting Nazism, and you can, get the hell off my wall.
Yeah, Nazi sympathizer was the buzz term thrown around to people who were against vigilante violence for some strange reason.
Yeah, and I pointed out, this argument is so obviously fallacious that it's pathetic, because it is entirely possible for you and I to agree that this particular thing is a problem and then disagree on what to do about it. It's also possible that we could agree that there's a problem, agree that we need to do something, agree what type of thing we need to do, and disagree about when violence is justified.
Yeah, I think I said if he ever tries to invade Poland, then, feel free to smack him in the chops. Exactly.
I'm not a pacifist. I'm supportive of defense of self, defense of others. I'm just trying to point out, a lot of this is coming from people who, back during the Gulf War, when the people who were essentially lobbying and supporting a potentially horrific military and unjustified military action, they'd say something like, well, why do you hate the troops? And what's curious is the people who would recognize the problem with that argument are making the exact same argument with regard to Nazis. And so I asked, I'm like, okay, let's get this clear. Is it okay to sucker punch a Nazi that, just standing on the street corner? All right. What about kicking them? Can you kick them? How about can I cut them as long as I don't cut anything off? Or can I cut something off? And then progressing down to just outright just killing them on the street. Now, clearly, at some point, people are going to go in that progression. The people who I'm disagreeing with are going to say, "Oh, well, now you're just being ridiculous. This is a slippery slope. Nobody's advocating that," and I agree. But my point is, you're going to draw a line somewhere, and I'm going to draw a line somewhere. And the disagreement here is about where we draw that line and why.
Yeah.
And if your response is that anything short of complete agreement with you advocating for sucker punching people makes me a Nazi supporter. I mean, here's the thing. We still, as far as I'm aware, we still don't know who punched Richard Spencer.
Yes.
Which means we can't know why. Now, I agree that it's reasonable, given what we know, that it's likely somebody recognized him as a, white nationalist, garbage, idea having individual and went up and punched him for that. But you haven't ruled out the possibility that, Spencer cut him off in traffic or had an argument with him about something else. You haven't ruled any of that out. But the other thing, which I thought was even more telling, is if Richard Spencer is actually terrible, and I think he genuinely is, at least on those issues and perhaps more, and he knows that he's going to be interviewed, wouldn't it be a really cool thing for him to pay somebody to punch him?
That's interesting. He looked very surprised, though, so he's either got a future in acting...
No. I'm not remotely suggesting that he actually did that. I raise it as a thought experiment because this is the sort of thing that worked in his favor in some regards.
Definitely.
At least with his base. So if it's possible, or at least reasonable, that he could have paid someone to punch him for, in this scenario, then by definition, whoever did it, if they weren't paid, they were playing into his hand. Because what he gets to do is say, look, I'm giving an interview where I talk about how I don't actually hate minorities, how, yes, I would prefer a white nation, but I want them all to live peacefully. And by the way, when you push him on that, he acknowledges that that's impossible and it'll probably require bloodshed.
Yeah.
So he is, in some ways, essentially advocating for genocide. But advocating, your position and then taking the steps to enact it, there's a slight difference there. But if hiring somebody to punch him is something that would have been strategically wise for him, then by definition, it's strategically unwise for the opposition, because he now gets to stand there and say, look, this is exactly what I'm talking about. I'm not part of the KKK. I'm not part of the Nazis. I'm not advocating for violence. And yet merely standing here exercising my free speech, somebody comes up and punches me.
Yeah, I mean, the man goes straight to Twitter and says they only assault me because they can't defeat my ideas. Right. Yeah, exactly. But I mean, I think it's worth pointing out as well there, you mentioned this idea of the slippery slope where you ask some very good questions. Well, if a punch is okay, is a kick okay? How about, cutting off an appendage? But I mean, I think what people need to realise as well, I mean, who decides how we quantify the force in this sucker punch, how much is too much? And, these hundreds and hundreds of men and women as well, probably incarcerated right now just from a single punch to somebody because they fell and hit their head, they've, head trauma. It's essentially, it's a manslaughter situation waiting to happen as well. So, I mean, and especially a sucker punch, you had no idea this was coming. So, I mean, it could have been seen in some eyes as attempted murder, depending on the outcome of it.
Yeah, and so the other questions, that I had during these discussions is, okay, if it's okay to just punch Nazis just because they're Nazis, which, by the way, I argued is nothing more than special pleading. You are avoiding actually giving a justification beyond these people have ideas that I find deplorable. I agree with you; those ideas are deplorable. But if it's okay to punch them, does that mean that it's okay to punch any of them? Like if there's a man and a woman standing there and they're both Nazis, can I punch both of them, or is there a problem with me punching the woman? Do I have to get my wife to punch her? What about those two little blonde-haired, blue-eyed girls? They were called Prussian Blue. They were these little girls who were raised by neo-Nazis, and they had a singing group and put out songs full of just god-awful, hateful, ideas. Now they are no longer associated with the neo-Nazis. And my wife likes to joke that they've probably had sex with lots of black guys at this point, just for the irony. But there was a period of time where these two little cute blonde-haired, blue-eyed girls are singing and saying the most hateful stuff because they've been indoctrinated. They were singing and saying things that were clearly worse than what Spencer was saying in that particular interview. I know he said awful or awfuler. Is that even? He said things that are more awful elsewhere.
Much worse.
Yes. The question is, do I get to, punch those little girls, or do I, So there's going to be a line drawn. That's the only point that I was, in any way trying to make, is that if you're going to say that you are correct in where you're drawing the line and that this particular situation warranted violence, you actually have to do the work in making the case. And if somebody presents their reasons for why they don't agree that violence is particularly justified in this case, and all you do to counter that is say that they're supporting Nazis, I mean, that is identical to the why do you hate the troops type of thing. You've done nothing to defend your position. You're just narrowing the only people who are going to agree with you are the ones who already agreed with you. You're not in any way convincing them.
Do you not think it's some strange romanticized fantasy, this idea? They talk about it like they've literally defeated Hitler because they've punched some lunatic with a shit haircut on the streets of Washington DC. They talk about it like they've defeated the Third Reich. I think reading some of Douglas Murray's work, he says, we really want Nazis. We really want Nazis to defeat, and there seems to be a supply and demand issue in that respect.
I think there's certainly something to that. I don't think that, I'm not convinced that they think that they've defeated Nazis. I think that what happened is these are good people who are absolutely terrified of a fascist regime taking over, who are reminded of incidents in the past, who want to make sure that when they say never again, they guarantee that this is never going to happen again. And because of that, they're willing to, start a little earlier. They're willing to jump the gun a little bit. And it feels good because in their eyes, this is justice. And I fully recognize that, like if I was a police officer standing there, I would have had to arrest the person who punched. Why can I never remember this? Richard Spencer.
He's best forgotten. I think you've got the best approach.
But I would have had to arrest the guy who punched him. If I was the district attorney, I may or may not have. Well, I certainly didn't have to prosecute because we give district attorneys a lot of discretion in the U.S. Actually, more discretion than we give judges, which I think is a problem. But if I was the judge, I would have probably said, hey, give me 5 hours of community service because it's very clear there was very little damage done. And this is one of the things that I talked about as well, and that's, I can't count the number of times people have said, intent isn't magic, intent isn't magic, intent isn't magic. It's become a mantra. And I agree. Intent isn't magic. It's not. There's a difference between whether something is excusable and whether or not it's understandable. Like I can understand why somebody would want to punch a Nazi, but that doesn't make it excusable.
Yes.
And an individual's intent doesn't exonerate them. So it's like, hey, I didn't intend to burn down your house. Well, I don't care whether you intended to burn down my house or not. You did it, so you're responsible. But intent also isn't irrelevant. And that's when people say intent isn't magic, they are trying to make intent irrelevant. And it's not, because considering the motivations is exactly what we do. It's the difference between, manslaughter and murder through. It is intent is the difference there. So what I caution people is, yeah, you're correct. Intent isn't magic, but that doesn't make it irrelevant. And if your little mantra is an attempt to make it irrelevant, then I think you've made a mistake. I think there seems to be an unwillingness to consider nuanced positions. People who I've spoken to who say, the truth isn't necessarily over here, and because it's not there, the truth is also not necessarily in the middle. Okay, cool, you get it. You haven't identified one side could be right, one could be wrong, or they could both be wrong and the truth could be somewhere else. And so, but when the nuance seems to conflict with, people's biases, or what they already believe, not only do they toss nuance out the window, but they then avoid any precision in evaluating what somebody said.
That's really interesting because I've been especially disappointed by people who I previously was fond of the work that they'd done, and I've had conversations with them, seem very bright, peace-loving people. And the way that they've lent into celebrating it, not only celebrating it, which, like you say, you can kind of understand the excitement and pleasure of somebody very unpleasant being punched. I think we can all agree. But they went on to endorse it and even advocate it, which I found very...
And call for more.
Call for it more, exactly. And that's what tipped me over the edge with these people a little bit. I mean, one in particular, I actually searched for references of violence in their timeline, and less than 18 months ago, they were making noises like, if you have to use violence for your ideas, then your ideas are worthless, violence is ignorant and cowardly. And then when you hold these statements up next to what they're saying now, the vitriol mirrored back just for pointing out this strange cognitive dissonance it was extraordinary to see from normally sensible people.
Yeah, and it's, without getting into a big discussion about, or a derail into a discussion about allies, there are people who I agree with on the issue and would be happy to work with them. And yet before I can even say, hang on a second, I'm not sure that I'm ready to advocate for violence here, they have flatly said if you're not willing to endorse this violence, then, basically piss off. You are part of the enemy.
Yes.
And I look at that, and it makes me sad more than anything else, because I still recognize that these individuals have the best possible intentions of creating a better world, but the frustration of the situation they find themselves in is making them advocate. Surely, within like a week or so after the punch was the Berkeley demonstration against Milo, and there's a number of topics in here that we can talk about, including free speech, triggering safe spaces, university limits, and all this other stuff. But the first thing that struck me is there was some violence and property destruction that took place. Basically, somebody came in and broke a couple windows and set a fire.
Yeah, Starbucks always gets it first.
Yeah, there wasn't a great deal of damage, but what I saw right off the bat was, if you care more about two broken windows than you do about the people who are the victims of hatred, then you're a big piece of shit and you should go away.
Yes.
And that is a complete straw man, because I don't care about two broken windows. By the way, I could break windows here in my house if I want to. So, I mean, if you're going to make bad arguments, I mean, I can go that way too. What I care about is people who are suggesting that violence and property destruction are acceptable. It would have been really easy. And imagine I was there at Berkeley, protesting, Milo, who I'm sure we'll get into that at some point. And somebody runs up and breaks windows and sets a fire. It's really easy for me to say, look, I was here for a peaceful protest, to exercise my free speech rights, to make the university and the community aware of what I considered to be the type of ideas that we should be endorsing and celebrating. And I absolutely also decry the violence and the property destruction here. How hard was that? But instead, and we're not even sure, there were a whole bunch of peaceful protesters, and then this group of individuals came in and did something.
Yeah.
Now, going back to the possibilities of, Spencer having somebody come and punch him, well, for all I know, hey, let's turn this into a media spectacle to get some attention on my side. So why don't you guys go out and break a window, and we'll blame it on the protesters? It seems to me that it would be not only truly easy, but in everybody's best interest to say, yes, we're here to support a peaceful protest. We are not in any way endorsing this violence that happened. It's, blah. And I'm sure there are some people who did that. But some of the people who I expected to do that did the opposite, and basically pulled the same "why do you hate the troops" argument of, if you care more about a broken window than people who are victims of violence. Well, that's a false dichotomy that doesn't represent my position at all. I care very much about people who are victims of hate crimes and hate speech. I care very much about having better ideas, but I also think that at the time when windows were broken and fires were set, I don't know how anybody could reasonably justify that at all. Yeah,
I had exactly the same experience. People essentially saying, if I'm going to cry over that more than than a Nazi getting punched and making these false equivalencies. But I mean, let's get your take on Milo Yiannopoulos, because I would never have known who he was. He wouldn't have even registered on my radar were it not for the constant attempts to shut him down. I mean, I don't find him nearly as impressive as his fans do. I also don't find him as evil as his detractors. And he's just one of them people now, unfortunately, where he's become necessary to keep an eye on. He's almost essential, because he's become a proxy whereby you can measure the state of free speech on American and UK campuses to that extent. So I just wanted to get your approximation on who he is in your mind.
I probably don't know enough about him. I've seen things from him. The overwhelming majority of things that I've seen from him, I find either unimpressive or terrible. Just, the presentations of his character and his ideas are, from what I've seen, things that I almost universally reject. Is it possible that he said some things that I agree with? Sure. But that's true for everybody.
Yes.
I have there, it reminds me. So when Trump was asked the other day, hey, do you respect Putin? And he was like, oh, yeah. But he's a killer. Oh, well, you think our country's so innocent and stuff. I think that was, absolutely deplorable. If somebody asked me if I respect Vladimir Putin, I would say not particularly. Mm-hmm. I don't tend to respect people who use immoral tactics to silence and or kill the opposition in order to retain power. Now, there is this idea of the difference between respecting an individual and respecting their position, and there's a difference between respecting their position and respecting their right to hold a position. And you could certainly say, of course, I respect Putin, because what I mean by that is I am respecting the head of a foreign nation that I'm going to have to work with. And perhaps we're speaking more about diplomacy. When it comes to Milo, is it Milo or Milo?
I think it depends if you're British or American. I say Milo. He is British, but I think Milo's fine. Okay.
I'll go with Milo, and I'll use as many Britishisms as possible during this. If I have to go to the loo, or, if something is the dog's bollocks, I'll say that.
Excellent.
So I, from what I've seen of him, I can't stand him. Now, I don't have enough time to go through and listen to everything that he said to try to find something that I like or agree with.
Yes.
That's not how I do things. I'm presented with, he said this, he did this, and I'm like, yep, that's awful, okay. I'm not willing to, I don't tend to judge and say that, judge a person's entire character. It's like, this is a terrible person. Instead, I prefer to say, what I know about this person, they have absolutely deplorable ideas or things that I reject or find deplorable. Because I'm sure Hitler loved his mom, I'm sure, well, maybe Milo loves his mom. I don't know. So on his assessment as a human being, I don't have a positive assessment from what I've seen. I think I've seen enough that I don't necessarily feel the urge to go digging to find something redeemable. But that said, on this notion of free speech, there's once again, we're talking about a term that has a number of different connotations.
Yeah, I struggle with this, especially when having a conversation with it with my American cousins. We always tend to have different feelings on what free speech means.
Well, let's see if we can sort that out.
Great. Diplomatic relations. In
the U.S., the primary usage of free speech relates only to whether or not you can be legally prevented from saying things.
Yes.
It is all about actions from the government.
This is the First Amendment.
Yeah, this is the First Amendment to the Constitution that basically says, we've carved out some exceptions through case law, and some of them I'm okay with. The kind of generic idea of shouting fire in a crowded theater when there's not a fire. Other things that we've carved out, I'm extremely opposed to. I reject the Supreme Court's decision on fighting words, even though that's not a free speech type thing, or it's not necessarily that. Anyway, back to the point. You have a right in the United States to speak freely without fear of being imprisoned for what you say. That doesn't mean that you have a right to any particular podium or venue that isn't like public. Like our state capitol here is public ground. It belongs to the people. Anybody can and should be allowed to go in and schedule time to speak on the steps of the Capitol. You can have your white supremacist group do it. You can have your Christian group do it. You can have your atheist group do it. You can have the Satanist group do it. And if it turns out that the government is only or primarily allowing Christians to do it, and they're denying the atheists and the Satanists and the white supremacists, that is a violation of, of equivalent freedoms for people. So when it comes to like the university, even for state universities, and one of the things is, when I did that event in Vancouver with Dawkins, I spoke to some people afterwards because we have a slightly different view on universities. And I don't think it's just because he was a professor and I was not even an attendee. I think there's a difference in the view of what universities are and should be between the U.S. and the U.K. and perhaps elsewhere. And my take is really simple. If you come in my house and start yelling things at my guests, I get to remove you. And doing so isn't a violation of your free speech rights, because you don't have any right to say whatever you want in my house without repercussions from me. We can't arrest you, and you can stand out on the street corner on public ground, and as we walk by, you can say whatever the hell you want about my wife and my guests, and I can't do anything about that. So in this private venue that is my home, I am sovereign. We basically support the idea that people are sovereign in their persons and in their private property type thing.
Right.
So it's not a free speech violation for me to say, nope, you don't get to say that in my house, go away. Same thing applies on my Facebook wall, because we or whatever forum I'm doing. Universities have the right to invite anybody they want to speak, and they have to face the repercussions. If a university just keeps inviting Nazis to speak, there are going to be repercussions to that. They are not in any way doing something that is against the law. But also a university can say, no, we are not going to allow any white supremacists to speak on our campus. And that's also not a violation of the law, because this isn't a public venue that everyone has access to.
Yeah, no, I agree.
Okay, so we're on board there. I would also say that students, at least in American universities, are the customers. They are essentially paying to be educated. And as such, they have every right to stage a peaceful protest, to let the university know, hey, this isn't who we like. And the university is the one that ultimately needs to make a decision. Are we going to cater to what our actual paying customers, students, want? Or are we going to say, no, we think that this is important enough that despite objections, we're going to go for it. And then they will face whatever repercussions come from that. I mean, everybody's within their rights. It's only when, we step over into violence that I think we have a massive issue.
I think I agree with what you're saying there in the way it's informed by the First Amendment. I mean, just to give you a flavour of what Britain's like, I'm very envious of your First Amendment. I think if we could have a vote on whether we could have a First Amendment similar, I'd be all for it, because we're the kind of country where, although socially it's quite liberal, in terms of speech, especially hate speech laws, they're quite strict in the sense that I could open up my Twitter now and I know a number of things that I could tweet and the police would come and investigate. I could
because there are laws causing offense where you are.
Correct.
Yeah, I absolutely despise that.
Yeah, I think that's been rolled back a little bit, but there is still these very vague hate speech laws, and they're always trying to put motions forward to make them more strict to deal with this. It's back to Twitter again. This idea of online trolling and threats and abuse. I think it's taken a little bit too seriously, as appalling as it is. I think society should deal with that rather than the state. But when I talk about free speech, I'm more or less talking about the principle of it. So, in my view, if someone like Milo's been invited to the university and he's prevented from making that arrangement due to either peaceful protest, preventing him from access, or the violence we've seen, I see that as a violation of freedom of expression. Just in principle, I think.
Sure.
The idea of the paying students makes really good sense in terms of the customer, the model. But I think also on the flip side of it, there's a lot of ex-students, very wealthy, in high-paid jobs now that fund a lot of these universities, which they're actually now pulling their funding from places like Berkeley because they're not pleased with what they're seeing in terms of how hostile it is to entertaining opposing ideas. I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
But that's their right too. Yeah. I mean, this is what I mean by the university is going to face consequences. I think one of the things is one of the things we have to recognize is, first of all, Milo wasn't invited to speak at the university by the university. In fact, what happened is there was a club, and there are a number of student clubs who. And we have to be, if we're going to allow a bunch of clubs on a university, we have to allow equal access to things. So this is something that I fight all the time, because Campus Crusade for Christ and other Christian groups are incredibly well funded, and every university is going to let them do whatever they want to do without question. And so they will bring in speakers. Now, the local atheist or secular group would like to bring in speakers. Maybe they'd like to bring in, me or Seth or Greta Christina or whoever. Somebody is going to be offended no matter what.
Yes.
And I will be frank that when it comes, my goal is not to offend people. I can certainly empathize with people who've been offended, but you don't have any right to not be offended. And if your reason for objecting to something is merely because it causes you offense, I don't give a rat's ass. You don't have a right to impose that upon others. So this group invited Milo to talk. I think that the students who protested it had every right to. I don't think that if it reaches the point where the protest is such that the event has to be canceled due to threats of violence or obstructing entrance into there, now I have an objection, because that other small group of students who you think are absolutely deplorable, and I perhaps agree, and I don't mean necessarily you, Stephen, but you, whoever I'm talking to, they also have a right to use that space. And if we don't protect, first of all, unpopular speech is the only speech that needs protection.
Yes.
Popular speech needs no protection. And the speech that coincides with majority needs no protection because it's automatically protected.
Yeah.
This is the reason why I'm not embarrassed by my country even today. I am embarrassed by certain segments of the country. I'm certainly embarrassed by our president and the current administration. That's more about, ideological views and where we're opposed, and also the fact that he's a dumbass who's somebody asked me the other day, do I think that we're going to end up in a war? And I was like, I'm not necessarily that negative, I guess. But if we went to war next week, it actually would not surprise me at all.
It's more likely to be civil war at this point, I think. That
is absolutely terrifying. But so the university allows the student groups to invite people. And I think that the students who object have a right to protest. They don't have a right I would say, to block access to that. They should not be engaged in acts of violence. And this intentional. So the whole point of the protest wasn't to say, we object to these views. We object to these views being on our campus. We object to these views being potentially viewed as representative of, the majority of our community. The intent of that was to say, we're going to go there and disrupt things until he's not allowed to speak. And while that's not a violation of his First Amendment free speech rights, because he doesn't have any right to speak, it is a violation of the rights of that other student group who should be equally allowed to bring in the speakers that coincide with their values.
It's the right to hear as well as speak.
I think so. One of the things is there is no right to hear. There's no right to not be offended. There is no you don't have a right to a particular podium, and you don't have a right to an audience, which is why if I'm giving a lecture somewhere, and I'm happy to have people, call out questions in most any time I talk. But if somebody becomes a disruption and is just, heckling and harassing and doing this barrage of questions, we have every right to remove them, because this organization has privately arranged for this venue and set up a podium, and they've given me the podium and not the person out in the audience who feels that they have a right to be heard, so we can remove them. And by the way, in saying this, I recognize that if I'm up there speaking and the people who invited me are so appalled by what I have to say, they have every right to escort my dumb ass right off the stage and out of there as well. I think it's generally unlikely to happen because I tend to not engage in much hyperbole and try my best to make good arguments. This is why when we were talking about before we did this, I constantly have people say, oh, Matt's really good on religion, but he's awful on, social justice, feminism.
Oh, yeah, stay in your lane.
Yeah, and I've repeatedly, when this comes up, I ask them two things. What is my position, and why do you think it's wrong? And so far, nobody's been able to answer the first one correctly, which means I must be a terrible communicator. I must just be sitting here babbling. But instead, what ends up happening is they'll sell me with somebody else's position. And it happens most often around the feminist label, not to dive off into another tangent. But I think it's relevant. And that is, this is the example that I've used over and over. I'm a feminist. What does that mean? Well, you'll have to actually ask me about specific issues, because feminism is one of those things where there are a number of different positions rolled up under a single label. But if I say I'm a feminist, then somebody thinks, or based on what they've seen from somebody else who uses that same label, oh, well, you just hate men, or you're a cuck, or you're only, I'm not supposed to say that one, or you're only doing this to get laid, or you think that women make 70 cents on a dollar, or whatever particular argument that or position they reject. And so what I've done to kind of respond to this is say, what is the feminist position on pornography? There isn't one. If you talk to Sunsara Taylor or Tasleema Nasreen, they identify as feminists, and they are vehemently anti-porn. Porn is completely unacceptable. If instead you were to go talk to Greta Christina, who also identifies as a feminist, not only is she not anti-porn, but she's a former sex worker who edits a porn magazine. Now, you have to recognize that labels are only as useful as their ability to convey information. There's a part of me that wants to just throw aside the labels that are too convoluted, except that I see value in still using some of them. When I talk about, hey, I'm a feminist, what I'm saying is women are people too. We should do what we can to end discrimination. I'm not saying that women make 70 cents on a dollar, but it's also not exactly equal. There are arguments to be made that the inequality may be due to naturalistic circumstances. We can have those discussions. But if at the end of the day, all I'm getting is, oh, you're an SJW regressive feminist blah blah blah, and they've actually added no content to the discussion, and then I say, okay, which position of mine do you reject and why? They can't even get the first one right.
I think, yeah, I absolutely agree there, because I'm somebody who identifies as a feminist, and so on one hand, I'll be told by people I'm an imbecile for identifying as a feminist. It's the terrible idea, it's feminazis, etc. And then on the other hand, from things that I've recorded or wrote on a blog, I'll be told that I'm anti-feminist. So yeah, like you say, it's a term that really needs fleshing out. But in terms of this social justice warrior thing, I think now it's mostly become a pejorative, SJW, when really the idea of social justice is just a great idea, really. I don't know why anyone wouldn't want to be for that, but I think what happens is a large enough group of people hijacks that cause and runs it into the ground with pure identity politics. And these people, as far as I can see, just seem to be people who have opinions on the internet. They don't really seem to be advocating any sort of social justice or change in the real world. They just tend to go for people who don't quite fit their particular labels. So I think social justice needs to reinvent itself somewhat, because it has predominantly become this kind of thing where these people will just go out and attack people for not, clearing their bar of what a bigot is, I think. Yeah,
I think one of the big concerns, everybody recognizes that, well, anybody who's familiar with American politics, I have to always caution myself on the perceptions of the United States of America outside of it aren't necessarily accurate, and certainly aren't necessarily going to be identical to the people who are actually living here.
Sure.
But most people are at least familiar with terms like Republican, Democrat, et cetera. Mm-hmm. I have been both. I was a Rush Limbaugh, ditto-head fundamentalist Christian Republican, and now I'm about as opposite from that as you could get. But I recognize there are things formally written in the party platform for the Democratic Party that I disagree with. And there are things in the Republican platform that I agree with. In the Libertarian platform, there are things I agree with and disagree with. I've just cited and tend to use the label that mostly reflects my agreement. And people normally get this. They recognize, if they've done any, self-reflection, that they don't agree with everything in the platform for the party that they mostly side with. And as long as people will recognize that, I think that there's room to actually have conversations. As soon as somebody says, "Oh, you're a Republican, so you want government just small enough to fit in my uterus, which is a great line that exposes one of the things that the Republican Party seems to want to do. But it's this, the hyperbolic, exaggeration again, because there are people who, if there are 20 things in each platform, and you recognize that you only agree with maybe 16, well, somebody else might also only agree with 16 in your platform, but there are different 16 because people prioritize things differently. At the top of the show, I mentioned this idea of being liberally, socially liberal and financially conservative. And Greta wrote a great piece once upon a time about how those things are in conflict, and I completely agree. It was funny because I had this epiphany about how they were in conflict, and I was sitting in my chair starting to write up a blog posty type thing about it. And Beth looks over at me and she goes, "What are you doing?" And I said, I just had this really, interesting, I think, epiphany about this potential conflict, and I want to write it out and think about it. And she's like, "Greta already wrote that." I was like, "Oh no, well, send me what and so I read it, and I didn't have any discovery at all. She got it. But I think, if you recognize that that's the case, then it makes you more honest in addressing things. It means that you don't get to take the lazy shortcut way of saying, "Oh, let me construct what is essentially a straw man of you, and because you use this label, that I can make arguments against any label." Anything that addresses more than one position is why the atheist labels I'm fine with, because it only addresses one thing: do you believe in a God? Humanism addresses a bit more. Skepticism addresses a bit more. You could make arguments against any of that. The question is, are those arguments honest? Are they accurate?
Just to pull it back to what you're saying about labels, and I don't think I'm sure you must have spoke about this at some point, but I've not heard you do it. And it's this idea of atheism as a sort of a political community, as if we can organise around the term atheism. And I kind of understood the merit in it a while back. I'm becoming a bit disillusioned with it now. I kind of think it's absolutely pointless to try and organise yourself around the term atheism. I think it's good to normalise that word and get it out there so people see it. But I think in terms of creating groups around that one term, in terms of how diverse people's, politics are and other beliefs, do you think it has much worth in that sense?
Not really. The more you add to the label, the more problematic it becomes, which is why I kind of like the idea of atheism is just, hey, you don't believe in God. And I can find a label for almost anything else. That said, I also recognize that the atheist community, not having a belief in God, that there are consequences to that, that you don't get to appeal to God to justify certain positions. And what we find, at least in the West, is that those who identify as atheist tend to be more left-leaning than not, and tend to be more left-leaning on social issues than not. That doesn't necessarily mean we all agree. I think there's benefit in leveraging some of that. What I don't think there's benefit in is spending a bunch of time trying to turn a non-homogeneous group into one that's homogeneous.
Yes.
And so what we did with the atheist community of Austin is I wrote up a list of position statements for the group. And they were in keeping with our Constitution and bylaws, which were supportive of church-state separation. And so the only positions we had were ones that we could clearly tie back to church-state separation issues in some way. There was disagreement about how strongly we could make these connections. But it's a fairly short list. It is... I wrote it, so it's definitely more socially liberal, but I think that everything we wrote is in keeping with our church-state separation foundation. But we also said no member of the atheist community of Austin is expected to, we're not expecting agreement to any or all of these as a condition of membership. We are putting these forward as what the group is going to do. If you have serious disagreement with the group moving this direction, then the group may not be for you. But the only requirement for membership is that you not have a belief in God and you pay the $30 or whatever it is to be a member. It was basically just saying this is what we're going to be about, that we are not just a TV show where people call in to argue, that we are a community of people who are going to work towards specific goals. And they were fairly simple. It was for science-based sex education in schools. It was for marriage equality, because we basically made the argument that apart from religious objections, we could find no objections to marriage equality that were secular and sound, because any of the objections people had would also apply to interracial marriage, or, and there were people who were like, well, I don't think there should be any marriage. Marriage should have no, I get that. I may even agree with that position. I'm not completely sure whether or not, a couple getting married should have benefits from the government for doing this. I understand the arguments for it, that you're building communities and other stuff, and I know the value of that. But at the end of the day, as long as there's going to be marriage, I felt that it needed to be available to everybody, which is why we wrote the position the way we did. And I think that if people recognize this, I don't mind people saying, this particular atheist group is going to focus on this particular social justice issue. You have every right to do that. Your atheist group can be, let's go down to the pub and drink and talk shit about religion.
Yes. Where do I sign?
I'm there. But it's not the only thing I want to do.
Sure.
And I think part of the problem is thinking that all atheist groups and all atheist communities need to be exactly the same and focused on all the same things. And if your group doesn't do this, then you're a crappy group. And if the group that's in my area doesn't agree with me, well, then they're just awful. It reminds me of the people. So there was this women's march a couple weeks ago, and I went. And in all honesty, because I always strive to be as honest as I can, I was frustrated at parts of it. I was definitely, out there in support of Planned Parenthood was my primary reason for going. But there seemed to be a lot of confusion. There seemed to be a lot of people out there for a lot of different reasons. And I'm not sure that there was despite that we had massive crowds, actually it was too big. It was obnoxious. And we ended up, leaving kind of halfway through because I couldn't walk. It was a shockingly hot day in Austin in the middle of the winter. But what it was supposed to be about and what I viewed it about, I supported. And there were a number of other people there for other causes, and I would agree with them on most of them. There were some there that I didn't necessarily agree with. There was one young lady who I greatly admired. So you can go topless in Austin. You don't have to, as a woman. I can go topless anywhere. It's just nobody wants to see that. You can, as long as you're not inciting a riot, essentially, you can be topless. And it's one of my wife's favorite things to do with her friends. As soon as some of her friends found out, I can just walk down the street with my titties out? Yeah, you can. And they would just peel their top off and go, woo, and it was
USA.
Yeah, move here. But so this one young lady was topless, and she had put some black tape over her nipples, just to avoid the hassle of someone who might have objected.
Right.
But she had written on her chest, still not asking for it, which I thought was a brilliant way to make that message.
Yeah, that's a good idea. That's great.
Unfortunately, she was also carrying a sign that had a butcher knife on it that said, "Kill your local rapist."
Oh, okay.
And as much as this gets back to what we were talking about earlier. I want every person who is guilty of rape to be caught and prosecuted and imprisoned. And what I would ideally prefer is that they actually get some help. I want us to, I'm in partial agreement with Sam Harris about the possibility of, in the future, us understanding neuroscience enough to be able to not necessarily eliminate all criminal activity. I think that's a little utopian, but we may be able to find ways to help some people. For example, Charles Whitman, who's here in Austin, climbed the tower at the campus and shot a whole bunch of people. He kept begging. He's like, look, when I'm dead, please do an autopsy because there's something wrong with me. He recognized there was something wrong. And of course, when they did the autopsy, they found a brain tumor. And so I'm absolutely against rape and feel that she definitely is not asking for it. I don't care if she's naked with her legs spread. That's still not saying have sex with me. And I think that those things need to be encouraged and education needs to be encouraged, but I also am fully behind the idea of prosecuting and locking up rapists. But if your sign is so simple that it's just a butcher knife that says kill your local rapist, that is a violent notion. That is vigilante justice that I cannot support. I fully understand why that idea appeals to people. All right, I'll take that back. I can't say I fully understand because I'm not a victim of that crime. So I don't want to falsely put myself in the shoes, but I can at least empathize and understand. And this is where we get back to whether or not something is understandable versus whether it's excusable.
Well, yeah, I mean, for instance, I agree with you on this, but if someone was to rape somebody I love, I think I would be probably capable of killing that person. But I understand that'd still be wrong, because that's why we don't, as a civil society, allow, emotionally distressed members of, the bereaved families to carry out the requisite justice. We don't. That's why we have courts set up. That's why we have a prison set up. And also, if you kill your local rapist, a good person's then going to jail. Well, it depends how you define good here, but I'd rather just a rapist go to jail than somebody go to jail as a murderer because of that person as well.
I'm not sure I could do it. I mean, this is what I say when I say that I can understand this. Hey, somebody rapes my family member. I understand the mentality of people who could say, "Oh, I would just outright kill him."
Yeah, I mean, I just don't know.
I can't. I'm pretty sure that I could never actually do that. It is, by the way you get to like the Hatfield-McCoy situations where, oh, well, you did something to my family and then I did something to your family, and so then you did something back, and I don't think we have to go down and explain the potential problems with vigilante justice, but there's a difference between you and me, and you recognize that you think that it's possible that you could kill somebody having done that, and I don't think that I could, and yet that doesn't change the situation about what is in fact right and what we're willing to support.
Sure, no, I am.
Your knowledge is, and I would recognize that there are situations where it may be better for society and may be more moral that an individual who is a violent recidivistic rapist be removed from society, that situation could turn out to be more moral. And yet, I'm still at least largely opposed to the death penalty because of the problems with the system and the problems with our inability to be confident that we have in fact a guilty person who cannot be rehabilitated.
Yeah, I mean, I think it'd be morally wrong of me to kill a rapist. I'm not overly confident of being able to regulate my emotions to the level necessary not to. I think that's the only doubt. But
here's the interesting question on that. And this demonstrates a difference, I think, that gets back to the sucker punching on the street.
Right.
Somebody rapes someone in your family. And I guess we should probably put a content warning for frank discussions about rape here. But we didn't. So somebody rapes somebody in your family, and you then, after the fact, hunt them down and kill them.
Right.
That is a different situation from you walking into your house and catching someone in the act of doing it. And in that situation, in defense of others, it may not only be legally, but morally justified for you to use force, which may result in the death of that person. And I would argue that it's absolutely justified to use force. But then we get into the secondary discussion about deadly force. And what I find happening is people who are really, really convinced that they are trying to make the world a better place and I have to do this, they are not at all interested in any of the nuances and differences in that. It's just kill rapists, punch Nazis, woohoo.
Yeah, I've just realised where this is going to go now. I'm going to be accused of advocating killing rapists now when this goes out. So I might have to put a disclaimer up front and at the end, just so we're clear on that point, that you should never take the law into your own hands, I think is my position.
That's kind of interesting too, is there's, and you're not alone, and I know you're saying that in a little bit of a humorous bent. The number of people, prominent speaking people who you've seen on stages at secular events, who are currently terrified that they will slightly say the wrong thing in the wrong way and end up vilified for something they're not actually advocating is shocking. I've heard from many of them, and I've been in that position on occasion as well, where, I post 3 videos a month on the Atheist Debates Project, and they are almost always focused in on subjects surrounding the conversations between believers and non-believers in religious ideas. And without fail, I stopped reading comments on YouTube, apart from if they just happen to randomly pop up. I just don't really read them anymore.
That's probably wise.
Because I can put up a video about, the teleological argument, and one of the first comments, which will spawn a fight, and people will be commenting back and forth, is how, oh, Matt was associated with Atheism Plus or something many, many years ago. I have disagreed with every single person in this movement that I've had a conversation with about something. I mean, Dawkins, actually one of the reasons why I was so eager to do that event in Vancouver with Dawkins was because I have friends on both sides of any issue, or almost any issue. People who absolutely despise each other. I've had someone who I know and trust and love and respect tell me that this other person who I am friendly with, it's not like, we're best mates who hang out all the time, but I'm at least friendly with him. This person has said of the other that they are a lying sociopath who will say one thing to your face and something else behind your back, and they're absolutely a terrible human being and all this other stuff. That's a strange situation, because my interactions with the person being accused of being terrible have not been terrible. I recognize that this other person is telling me about their experiences with the individual. Most of the time, I can't find a justification to prioritize their experience over my own. What it does is it puts me in a position where I am cautious and where I am alert, where I am trying to see, have I made a mistake? Am I aligned with someone who is really, really bad, or is the person, have they just had, the other person have had a bad experience and they're a little hyperbolic? And that happens over and over again. I remember, well, I'm not going to name any names, but there were some public fights between people where I was friends with people on both sides. And without fail, it was, I'm going to judge them based on my experiences with them. I'm going to judge them based on what they actually said. And in some cases, their whole arguments against each other had nothing to do with the actual position of the other person. They had built this straw man image, and they were both arguing against something that wasn't real. And that's incredibly frustrating. And there's a lot of line drawing as, oh, you're friends with so-and-so, well, you must be terrible. So I wanted to do this event with Dawkins because there are several things where Dawkins and I disagree strongly. And I thought it would be great to have an opportunity to be sat there on stage. And if a subject came up in the discussion where we disagreed, I was hoping that we would be able to show people how to go about disagreeing without pointing at the other person and saying, you're an awful human being who needs to be completely drummed out of the movement and nobody should be associated with you.
Yeah.
Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that there aren't people who are in fact so awful that it would be best to not have them in any movement that you're associated with. I think there are. From what little I know of Milo, I'd have no desire to be associated with him or work with him or have him be representative of anything I'm associated with, even if he gets some things right somewhere. There's like a tipping point, and I think based on the information I have, he's crossed it.
Yeah, I mean, I think his style for a start, I mean, he could categorise him as a bully in the way he deals with things, and I just think it's kind of like, if he's your guy, if he's your defender on these big topics, I think you're probably doing it wrong. I understand him for like entertainment purposes a little bit sometimes, but to cite him as an authority, I think is a little bit strange. But I think you make a great point about drawing lines between people at the moment, because there is a lot of this guilt by association as well. Just the mere act of having spoke to somebody. I mean, I've done hundreds of podcasts now. I still get people sending me abuse because I had a conversation with somebody 2 years ago on my podcast, and by that association, I naturally must endorse everything they've said elsewhere. These people like Dave Rubin, who invites a lot of people on his show, which with some of the most questionable views I can think of, but he's having a discussion. He asks them what they think, they say it out loud, and we can all go away and draw our own conclusions. But just from the act of doing that, I've noticed there's kind of like a subset of atheist people on Twitter now who have cast him out. He's the worst thing imaginable. Somebody said that he's a more immediate threat than ISIS to me the other day. So I think this strange thing of casting people out for not being on every single point you are is really self-defeating, because if we want to attack the bigger issues head on, you need allies of all political persuasions, really.
Yeah, and it's one of the things is that it's possible that someone disagrees with me on a single point, and that single point is sufficient to me not wanting to be associated with them at all. And I have one clear example of this that happened on Twitter. I'm assuming that we probably disagree on other things, but I don't know this person. But they were an atheist who was arguing that basically against the idea of consent, including that they should be allowed to have sex with incredibly young people just if they can convince them that there's not this, basically let's chuck it all out the window and do whatever we can get away with type thing.
Wow.
That was sufficiently bad that I don't care what their other views are. I'm not going to be associated with them. I don't have enough time in my schedule to even bother having a conversation with that person. I'm hopeful that somebody will perhaps convince them of why they're wrong, and I'm happy to talk about why they're wrong. But, we all have limited time. It's along the same lines of you can't be an expert at everything. And so you get accused of having faith because you trust what knowledgeable people have to say in a certain area that you're not knowledgeable about. But the end of the Dawkins thing, so the one point where I thought we were going to be able to show a way to talk about a disagreement, it turns out we had no disagreement because I had already had a conversation with Lawrence Krauss and convinced him and changed his mind, and then he changed Dawkins' mind. So when I actually asked the question, I was kind of pushing towards here's an area where there might be disagreement. Dawkins' mind had already been changed. And I was like, well, that's out. And then the very last question asked something about universities. And I wasn't clear on exactly what they were asking. But Richard decided that it would be a good time to talk about safe spaces and snowflakes and how some people just need to get and grow up. And I disagree both with what he said and how he said it, but I think that there's more agreement on the subject than what most people would expect. Unfortunately, we had literally run up against the time limit for the event, and anything that I would have had to say and any conversation that I would have wanted to have with Richard about this would have just it was impossible given, we had to let people out of the theater. We had 1,400 people locked in a theater. And I don't give short answers, as you are well aware. So it wasn't the right time. So instead, I addressed it a little bit on Seth Andrews' 300th podcast. Because he turned it into this thing about content warnings, trigger safe spaces, and you go to university to be challenged and you should just grow up. And I agree that you go to one of the aspects of learning. You go to university to be educated. And one facet of being educated is to have your preconceptions challenged, to have your ignorance challenged. However, that doesn't mean that in my math class, I should be subjected to a side discussion about gender identity. And also, it doesn't mean, so I'm in favor of safe spaces at universities. Like at any given university, there should be some safe space for people who suffer from, hate speech or triggering, et cetera. I don't support the idea of turning the entire university into a safe space. I find that to be absurd. And I don't know why there's so much fighting about this, because at least at universities here in the West, that stuff already existed before anybody even said anything about it. There were There's an area on campus where you can table. There's an area on campus where street preachers can show up to spew their ignorance or hate. And these are generally well marked. And as long as people are aware of this so that they can navigate from one point of campus to another without, being accosted, that shouldn't be an issue. So I support this idea. But there are also people who were like, oh, well, triggering in PTSD isn't real unless you've, been in a war zone. Well, I can't, I maybe can't convince anybody of this, but they're wrong. I mean, I have seen this firsthand. I'm very close to someone who has a dramatic psychological triggered reaction to something for which there will never be a warning. It is something that is bizarre, and almost everyone would find it absurd. And yet, when it happens, there is this involuntary, just horrific breakdown of terror. And it's because this person was traumatized as a child. And so there was this great article that talked about the science behind cognitive behavioral therapy. And then they used the entire article as if it were an argument against content warnings, when the exact opposite is true. What we know about cognitive behavioral therapy is that it works within a particular process. So if someone has a fear of spiders and you just throw spiders at them, you're just an asshole. You are not in any way engaged in anything therapeutic.
It's called the flooding technique. I studied psychology in college. Not recommended.
Yeah. Oh, this should desensitize you, when really you very likely, in many or most situations, are going to be making it worse. Instead, if you begin with, in this box is a picture of a spider, and I want you to mentally prepare yourself. By the way, that is a content warning. Exactly what that is. And so is when I turn on Game of Thrones and I see that it's, strong sexual content, that's a content warning. It's the one that makes me want to watch that episode more. But people have framed content warnings as if they're a way for people to protect themselves from ever being challenged. And that's not true. A content warning exists so that you can make up your mind, I'm ready to see this now. I need a moment to prepare myself before I see that, or I'm not ready to see this now. All of those choices are available. So you say in the box is a picture of the spider, and then you gradually work up until they are able to actually, handle a spider. And that is the way you get over it. The weird thing for me is a lot of the people who are absolutely opposed to content warnings, who say things like, oh, just grow up. Well, just saying grow up has not, you're not demonstrating any empathy, you're not demonstrating any understanding of the position, and you're not doing anything to help. You're basically saying, I don't give a shit about your issue, which is you're well within your rights to do that. But don't get to pretend like you're helping.
I think it comes back to what we were saying before about defining your terms a little bit. And I think, these people who did dismiss trigger warnings as, you should grow up, you should stop using it to protect yourself from ideas. I think that's due in no small part to people actually using them that way, or you maybe even co-opting or hijacking might be better terms, because empathy, like you say, I think you've hit the nail on the head there. Why do we want to be an arsehole? Why do we want to make somebody feel bad, give them a bad time, make them psychologically unable to do day-to-day things that we take for granted? Of course you want to be able to support people in that manner, but I think what I've seen the last couple of years, especially with trigger warnings and safe spaces, that language, that whole language of these concepts has bled into attempts to censor things, whether it be a movie being shown on campus where people who don't even have to go to it, it's a voluntary event, will say, with its triggering, its content. These people like Mariam Namasi in the UK. I don't know if you're fully aware of her work. We literally had a group of young Islamist men sat in the front row who would basically come to this event of their own accord. They didn't have to, and they was literally shouting out the word safe space every time she tried to speak. So I think people like Dawkins and me to a certain extent get a perception of these concepts from that, and it all becomes about do we have to accept that these things have become them things? Do we need better terms? Do we need to better make people understand that there is another side to it as well?
Yeah, this is the problem, is that people are having conversations assuming that the person, that their interlocutor has the same understanding and the same history with the terms that they're using as they do. And that's simply false. I love Maryam Namazi. Actually, there's a really cool picture of the two of us at Imagine a Religion 2, I think. And people thought it was me with my mom because she looks a little like my mom. And one of the, I'm looking forward to going back over to the UK in particular so that I can go down to London and hang out with AC Grayling and Maryam Namazi and a bunch of other, folks in London who I greatly admire and appreciate. But there are certainly people who are going to take any good idea and run it past the point of absurdity.
Yes.
And so if we allow those people and that position to be what we argue against, that is like trying to argue against Christianity by pointing at Westboro Baptist Church. You are not pointing at any significant portion. You may only be pointing at the loudest portion, and perhaps only the loudest portion that you've experienced. So I fully support the idea of content warnings because they're really useful. You can say, hey, I'm ready for this. I'm not ready for this. I'm not ready for this now. It doesn't, censor anything. It doesn't say that we can't talk about this. It says, in fact, we are going to talk about this and you need to be aware of it. For the people who are trying to say, no, you will not talk about this anywhere on my campus or in my city, even if I'm not required to go and not required to be present, that is beyond absurd. That is you have an issue and you are imposing that on other people. Because guess what? If I want to go watch porn that freaks you out, you weren't invited in the first place. If I want to, the individual I was talking about who has that clear triggered PTSD reaction to something that, everybody would find absurd, and I can't talk about it, what it is specifically. All right, let's say it was something like fingernail clipping. If they were sitting around watching TV, there's never going to be a content warning for fingernail clipping. But if they were traumatized as a kid, locked in a closet and forced to, trim and chew off their nails and, whatever it was that led to this, when that happens on TV, they are going to freak out. Now, that person is in need of help. That person is in need of psychological counseling, and cognitive behavioral therapy may be the way to go. They are never going to be helped by just grow up. If they start campaigning that no depictions of fingernail clipping can ever be allowed anywhere, well, now I'm in serious disagreement with them. That their issue and their, whether it's offense or trauma, doesn't impact the rest of us, or shouldn't be permitted to impact the rest of us, because I could make a video about how to properly trim your nails that would actually be positive and useful and good for people.
Patreon exclusive, Matt Dillahunty, and how to trim your nails.
Yeah, if your PTSD is about, watching, children be slaughtered, okay, I think that is enough in society's interest that we probably shouldn't allow any depictions of children being slaughtered pretty much anywhere. Apart from educational purposes for training people on how to spot these things or child pornography, things like that. I'm good. I'm fine with censoring those things. I don't think that that freedom means hedonistic anarchy where there's no rules. I do think that there are limits, and this gets to who watches the watchers. Where do we draw the line? Well, first, there are some things that we know traumatize enough people that we can justify a content warning. There are other things where we're never going to realize that it's worth it. But in much the same way that, like I said, Game of Thrones has got a content warning at the beginning of it. And I haven't really heard any good reason for them not to put it there. It's useful for parents to say, hey, kids, you're not watching this episode. It's useful for people who are saying, you know what, I can't watch anything that is a depiction of a rape-like scene. But there are other people who have rape fantasies. There are other people who watch that and aren't traumatized, but are made aware of the significance of the problem, such that having that depiction becomes a positive thing in that it inspires them towards action to help make the world a better place. And every time that I try to point out these nuances in the position, I get objections from both sides. And as long as I keep getting objections from both sides, I'm okay with that. And I figured this out when I was doing the TV show. You know, it's obvious, you know intuitively, you're never going to make everybody happy. And I would get email about the TV show where somebody would say, oh, you were a complete asshole during this call. You were impatient. You were rude. You were awful. And somebody else would email and say, wow, you have the patience of a saint. I can't believe that call, you almost made me believe in God that you have so much patience. And they're talking about exactly the same call on the same show. And that put me in this position where I recognize that there isn't necessarily a right answer to everything, certainly not for everyone. If the feedback that I got was overwhelmingly negative, I evaluate that and I take steps to change how I talk about things. And this has happened with ableist language probably most recently, where on the show at many different times I would say, that's crazy, or you're a moron. And there are people who have made me aware that they view these as ableist terms. I am in agreement with them on some things, and I am in disagreement with them on others. I never say retard or retarded, other than I will say retard as in perhaps this retards progress, but I generally don't say that either. In the same way that people don't say niggardly, even though it's not, those two words have nothing to do with each other. It's just that there's so much stigma on the one that the other one has become, and I find it obnoxious when somebody actually will tweet or write niggardly, just kind of baiting somebody so that they can say, hey, those words, and that's obnoxious as well. But if I say that's crazy, I'm clearly I'm not addressing a person. I'm clearly using a colloquialism about absurdity, and I will try to alter my language when I think about it. And I'm trying to do a better job of thinking about it because it's not my intent to cause offense. However, if somebody says, you don't get to use the word stupid anymore. No, that's stupid. I don't care if some arcane psychological, if the old DSM or whatever used stupid in some kind of diagnostic thing. I'm not in any way disparaging people with mental illness and mental conditions by saying that a situation is stupid or that an individual is behaving stupidly. I get why people object to things like lame or crippled, but I also get that there's a context outside of there where it should be very clear to everybody that we are not disparaging the physically handicapped person, that there is a context there. And so there's this fine line that I walk and I wrestle with myself about, okay, which ones am I willing to scrub in order to show that I am aware of the problems, and there's no single word in the English language that I need, because there's always something else that can be used in its place. We have so many synonyms. I'm sure somewhere there's one word that has no synonym, but I'm not aware of it.
It's interesting because there has been, you touched on it briefly before about people who give a lot of public talks who are kind of terrified of saying the wrong thing, and there is a lot of language police at the moment, especially in terms of more cynical aspects of it, where people are trying to really, almost read your mind, or even to the point where someone's explained what they mean by a specific word and it's not good enough. An example that comes to mind recently, the British actor Benedict Cumberbatch. He was on one of your TV shows in America. Yeah, he's great. Seems like a great guy. And what he was doing there, I think he was kind of making a point that there's not enough opportunity afforded to black actors. He feels like there should be more opportunities for black actors, and he actually used the outmoded word coloured. I think it was coloured. And everybody in the press, the internet, as you'd expect, crucified him. So here we have a man who's quite clearly not a racist because he's advocating for more opportunities for black actors and almost trying to, champion their cause. But he uses this one outmoded word, and people can't seem to process the two things that are happening there at the same time. So completely take him down just for one of them. And why do you think that happens? Do you think when it's clear that he's not a racist?
Yeah, it's. I think Patton Oswalt talked about this in his last comedy special, Talking for Clapping, and I don't remember the specific bit, so I'd recommend. I think it's on Netflix. People can go watch it, and basically he used an example with regard to trans rights, and you had basically Billy Bob the Redneck, who was basically saying, I don't care who uses whatever bathroom they want to. I've got no problem with trannies, or something like that, where he used the word that would make everybody go, okay. I'm in agreement with Patton that the better course of action there, when you clearly have someone who is on your side and who is in the process of waking up to this sort of stuff, to say, hey, by the way, you said tranny, and that is considered extremely offensive to individuals who are transsexual. And here are the things that they prefer, because I have no problem at all using the words that people prefer and the genders that accurately identify them. So I had a conversation with someone, a trans friend of mine, about this, because there's a lot of complexity. There's not much complexity in whether or not a particular word is generally viewed as offensive. There's complexity in the broader issues. And I had noticed that there's a lot more acceptance for trans individuals than there has been in the past. And certainly a lot more people speaking out on behalf of equality and rights. But there's also an increase in fetishizing. And this is problematic. And it's what adds the complexity, because if in fact you have a fetish for trans individuals and you're out surfing the internet for porn, almost all of that porn that you're likely to find is going to be using she-male, lady, boy, tranny, all of the labels that are offensive and should be, shouldn't be used out of respect for what their preference is. Or the words that they don't find offensive, or labels they don't find offensive. So I was having this conversation about this, and I was like, where do you draw the line? Because the individuals who are performing in that seem to be giving credence to the labels. If you're a trans person and you are performing on, whatever hot she-male blah 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 type thing, and it's using this word, then it seems that you are almost endorsing it. And the kind of conclusion that we came to is that yes, it's complex and it's not easy, and it requires further education. There are people who are perfectly happy being fetishized, by the way, but the vast majority don't want to be fetishized. There's not always a quick and easy answer. And the best solution is to keep talking about these things and keep educating people about these things. It's kind of like we were talking about atheism with regard to politics and things like that. You and I mean, this is Dave Silverman's big thing that he's championing, is atheist normalcy, where the label doesn't have the baggage that it used to have. I fully support that, and I think that we're making rapid progress, and there are people who are frustrated that we're not making as rapid progress as they'd like. And while I understand and agree with their frustration, that sucks. But you kind of have to accept that and keep soldiering on to educate people, to try to get your point across. It's going to take time. I thought, and this gets back to the political climate in the United States, I was dumbfounded on election night, and still every day wake up in a mild disbelief that Donald Trump got elected as president. It's bizarre to me because he's so obviously not accurately relaying the truth over and over and over and over and over and over and over again. And it's so obvious to me that he has no clue. I mean, even to the point where I don't buy into the idea that he can't read, which has become kind of a joke, because he's better on the teleprompter than when he's not. So clearly he can read a little bit. But I do, like when I look at him, for years people would say, hey, you're not a psychologist. You shouldn't be armchair diagnosing anybody. You know, you don't get to decide who is a sociopath or who is delusional, you know, whatever. And I understand the caution behind that. But it's so absolutely obvious to me that this guy is a clueless narcissist. I don't think he's evil. I don't think he's out to destroy the world. I think that he is just absolutely an underinformed buffoon who's a narcissist. He only cares about himself. He goes out to the prayer breakfast for Black History Month and gives a speech that is about how cool he is, how awesome the election was, how the ratings for The Apprentice have dropped, and what world am I living in?
Well, you know what's particularly extraordinary to me about all this? It's not like he pretended to be somebody else all the way up to the run-up. All these things, he wore them on his sleeve for everyone to see. You know, he lent into them with as much force as possible. Everybody knew that this man was them things you just reeled out there, and I agree with you, certainly on the narcissistic point. And it's not like he's now got into the White House and he's pulled the mask back like some Scooby-Doo villain and he is Donald Trump. He's always been this way. People knew that was what they were getting, and I can't square them two things, unfortunately. I didn't expect the American people to vote. I mean, I get the feeling a lot of apathy towards politics played a part in this. I think a lot of people who found this man as silly and as buffoonish as you and I did, just thought, well, that guy's never going to get in. That guy, that problem will take care of itself. I don't need to vote.
I think it's a complex situation as to how we ended up with Trump. I don't think there's one easy answer. I think the Democratic Party has made tons and tons of mistakes. I think there was a lot of anti-Hillary. I think that, the thing that I talked about earlier about calling Trump supporters racist, no matter how accurate it was in the way that it was intended, doesn't match what's in their mind. Then we also know that voter turnout was a bit low, but I'm with you. I'm not mad at Trump for being Trump. I'm completely disheartened that a sufficient portion of the American population was happy enough to have this person be the most powerful man on the planet and their representative to the world. I remember, when I found my way out of religion, I did not suffer a lot of the traumatic experiences that other people do. I didn't feel a great sense of loss. I didn't have nightmares about a hell. For me, it was very, very liberating. And it was because I cared more about what was true than what felt good. It was because I knew I had done my best to investigate this and try to come to the truth. And yet that doesn't change the fact that I continued to feel a bit of anxiety at waking up every day in a world where something that was plainly, obviously the case was accepted by so few. Whether we're talking about, hey, is there sufficient reason to believe there's a God? No, that's almost obvious once you're actually sufficiently studied. And so I thought initially, rather naively, that I could find, the one argument to rule the world, to fix it all, to convince everyone. And then I realized that people believe for different reasons, and they're going to give it up for different reasons. There are people who are not going to be convinced by any particular exposition of logical fallacies. There are people who are not going to be convinced because you show the awfulness of their church structure. The Catholic Church is a criminal organization, and there are people who are Islam is not a religion of peace. You can say it over and over and over and over and over again. What you should be saying is that Islam is a collection of different views about a religion that all falls under one label, and that there are individuals in there who tend to focus on the peaceful aspects of that, who will probably never be a problem. And there are others who don't. And when those others who don't find themselves in a place where they have political power and access to arms, they are a violent threat to those who don't share their beliefs. That is, I think, and even that statement's not perfect. I'm just, off the top of my head. There needs to be precision in what we're actually talking about, because the oversimplifications are killing us. And it's the oversimplifications that I think allowed Trump to be elected. We need to defeat radical Islamic terrorism. Mm-hmm. Yeah, we do. We need to do something about immigration. Yeah, we do. We need to correct some problems. But simply saying that things aren't perfect doesn't mean we should nuke it from orbit, which is essentially what the American people decided they were largely okay with. I mean, granted, he didn't win the popular vote, but...
Yeah, it's going to be an interesting 4 years, and that's me being optimistic with the word interesting, but this has been really great to catch up. I'm just aware that we've managed to hurdle towards 2 hours, and it seems to have flown by. I was wondering if there's anything else you wanted to get in that I've not covered, that before you get back to your day.
No, I'm good. I was happy to have the conversation. This started because I saw people who were arguing on Twitter or Facebook, who both of whom I liked. I agreed with on some things and disagreed with on other things. And as we can see by the fact that we ran almost 2 hours, is I don't give short answers. So my arguments are never going to be good for Twitter. Basically, all you're going to get out of me on Twitter is, yes, no, here's the show.
Yeah, it's becoming an almost unbearable place to try and have a conversation. So I just try and have fun instead, which is probably not always conducive to the topics. But Matt, I really appreciate you coming on and the time. You're always a pleasure to speak to. Very reasonable, very candid.
I will make a prediction. Despite all the topics that we covered, one of the first things you're going to get is, he brought up Islam at the end and then you guys didn't talk about it.
Yep.
Okay. So, that's just an excuse to have another conversation some other time. And I also predict that despite doing my best to clarify what my thoughts are, they will still be strawmanned and I will be labeled, and you will too.
Yeah. I might put this little bit up front just so we can let people settle in case they don't get to the end of the chat. But no, yeah, that happens. I mean, there's a trend now of people taking you to task for the things you haven't said, which I find really strange. It's almost, clairvoyance, and which I find an odd approach from people who describe themselves largely as skeptics.
Who act like they can read minds.
Yes, exactly.
I'm with you.
All right, Matt. Like I say, it's been an absolute pleasure, and we'll definitely do this again some other time.
Cheers. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much to my superb guest, Matt Dillahunty, and thank you very much for listening. You can keep up to date on the podcast at gspellchecker.com. Think we've all learned something here today?